This is now Wednesday, June 15, 2005, continuing our narration on Shirley and my histories. And inasmuch as Russell is so diligent and wanted to get this done, it seems to me at some time you're all going to be a captive audience. I have to listen to all of these, whether you wish to or not. But it's an honor for us to be doing it. I would like to backtrack just a little bit to explain a little bit of about my mother. I talked a little more about my father, I believe. But I wanted to tell just this much about my mother, who was a beautiful lady. She was a little bit on the heavy side, somewhat on the heavy side, and yet her legs were always trim. So she carried herself very well, even though she was somewhat heavy. But she was a sweet Norwegian and the motherly grandmother type that we all love, and all of you would love to know and will love to know Jenny Emily Samuelson. While Father was, as I have explained before, the janitor and caretaker of the apartment building in which we lived, Mother, on the side, had some work of her own. And that work was taking in ironing and washing. Now that was difficult work for a matronly lady. We had out in our laundry room, which we had to walk through to get to our apartment, clear down the hall, had to walk through this kind of unsightly laundry room. But the laundry room had some tubs where you could put water in and do your washing. And that was for all the tenants. So they would come down, those who wished to, and do their washing in these wash tubs. They were bins of perhaps porcelain, I'm not sure. But Mother had nothing but a scrubbing brush, that is a scrubbing board. And these scrubbing boards, you probably don't even know what they are, but there's a flat board with ruffles on them. And so she would have to wash every garment by hand in this way over that ruffle board with White King soap. I remember so well. I used to have to go buy White King soap for her. And she would put that on the garments and in the water and wash them by hand this way, and then have to wring them out by hand. We had no such thing as washers and dryers, or wringers even. So she would have many white shirts and various other garments from her clientele. She had quite a few people who depended on her to do their washing. And then after the washing, she'd have to do the ironing of whatever it took in the way of trousers or shirts. And so that kept her busy, and she was a hard worker. And I, in turn, was her little laundry boy, delivery boy. So that on my bicycle, I would often go pick up the laundry to be done, as well as deliver it back when it was done. And this took the area of some of our apartment renters there who used her to do their work for them. And all up Canyon Road and up First Avenue, clear on up to A and B Street. She had people who asked her to help and do their laundry and ironing. She was so good at it that she had good clientele. But it really wore her out. It was very hard for her to keep this up. but nevertheless she did it uncomplainingly, and I on my bike had good exercise delivering the finished laundry to the various clientele up Canyon Road, up First Avenue, up Second Avenue, and I had good exercise on my bike up and down those hills.
What age were you, Grandpa, when you helped to deliver?
Well, that's a good question. The question is, what age was I? I think it might have been somewhere in the age of 10 to 12 up to 15. I mean, it lasted a few years that she was doing this and that I was helping out. Probably before me, and I would not really know this, probably before me, one of my brothers did the same thing.
So when you were 15 or so, she stopped?
It seems to me that was about the time that it was no longer healthy for her to continue. But I can still see her bent over that scrubbing board, scrubbing the scrubbing the dirt out by hand, and we think it's tough to use our washers and dryers, I guess, these days. And then she would have to hang them on the dryers. I described earlier that we had these pull-out dryers we'd hang the clothes on, push them in, and they had heat in them, and they would dry the clothing. So she had that to do, plus her regular taking care of her children and housework and cooking and whatever. I simply did not want that portion of our little family history to go unsaid regarding my parents. And I mentioned before that her brother, Carl Samuelson, was a fine operatic tenor and performed all over the valley as a noted operatic tenor. And Mother had a lovely alto voice, although she never developed it and didn't ever take time to develop her musical talents. She had a very difficult time translating from Norwegian to English. She finally got it down pretty well, and she could talk quite well in English. But writing it was very difficult for her. And I remember when I was on my mission for 2 years, I continued begging her to write to me to write a personal letter to me. My dad was very good at writing, and my other members of the family wrote occasionally. But my father was very good at writing, and he had learned to write English very well, and had good handwriting. But Mother struggled with it. But finally, I received one letter from her that she had handwritten herself to me while I was in the mission field. The one and only one I'd ever received. I believe I still have it somewhere because I did treasure it. Well, now, we were talking last time about missionary experiences, and I told about visiting the movie star. Her name was Edwina Booth. Excuse me. And the name of the movie was Trader Horn. And it was an outstanding, world-famous movie at the time. My recollection is that it was a silent movie, black and white, one of the very early ones that, and so it did not have the modern flair to it, but nevertheless was extremely well received worldwide. And then I told about Edwina Booth being the granddaughter of President Wilford Woodruff and how that we went to her home and gave her a blessing. Now that sparked another memory, as I told Russell, that I wanted to tell another experience that I thought was quite unique, in that we had another call, and this time this lady called personally to the mission home and asked the mission president if he could send 2 of the elders out to give her a blessing. She was out in West Los Angeles, and so we dutifully went on the trolleys and the transportation at hand at that time, and went out to West Los Angeles, knocked on the lady's door, and when she came to the door, I don't know that we even knew her name at the time. We may have. But when she came to the door, she looked totally disheveled. She looked like a hag to me, totally disheveled, and very much disconcerted and very much in need of a blessing, as it were, because she called for it. She welcomed us in, but she was not in good control at all. Her nerves and her actions were very unsettling. One elder, and I believe it was Elder Reed Burnett that was with me at that time. When we went into when she invited us into the apartment, we both looked at each other because we could feel the evil spirits. Now this sounds odd, I'm sure, but we could feel the clamor in the air, the humidity of the air, the darkness of it, the thickness of the atmosphere in that apartment when she admitted us. We knew that we had a problem on our hands. And while we were senior missionaries by this time, we'd had some experience by this time. We weren't greenies, is what I'm saying. So the first thing we asked her to do, if she would kneel down with us and have a prayer with us first, before we gave her a blessing. And I was mouth, and I literally felt that I had to cast out the evil spirits. Which I was prompted to do by the power of the priesthood and in the name of Jesus Christ, that the evil spirits would be cast out and depart. An unusual thing occurred. Her demeanor changed. The atmosphere of the room and the apartment changed to a much more uplifting and pleasant and normal manner and state. We then proceeded to give her a blessing, and we did so feeling very good about the blessing. And when we were finished, she had by that time straightened up her clothing and her hair and how she looked, so she improved her looks immensely, and her, as I say, her demeanor changed, and she was her normal self. Now, she went to the telephone and called on the telephone. She said, "I need to call New York." And we just sat there wondering what she was doing. And she called on the telephone to New York. And when she got the person on the other end of the line that she was calling, she called him by name, Jack. And she talked to Jack, and we found out that her brother was Jack Dempsey, who was the great former world boxing champion. And he was a Mormon, and she was a Mormon. And I remember as a youngster, and we as youngsters on our bicycles, driving up East South Temple Street in Salt Lake to 10th East and South Temple, and always trying to get a glimpse of Jack Dempsey, because that was his home. That's where he lived. Once in a while, we got a glimpse, and he could wave at us. But he was, of course, this world famous over the years, and still a famous boxing champion in his day. Was, of course, this world famous over the years, and still a famous boxing champion in his day. She talked to him on the phone and told him that she had had the elders there who administered to her, and how it had improved her so much, and how she felt so good since we had come and done so, and reassured him that that she was feeling well. It turns out that Jack Dempsey was at his restaurant, for he had the Jack Dempsey restaurant on Broadway in New York, a very famous restaurant at the time, which he ran and subsidized. And that's where he was when she called him, and so she talked to him right there at his restaurant and told him the situation. And I wanted to say, why not let me talk to him? I'd surely like to talk to Jack Dempsey. And this was his sister, and I'm not sure if we knew her name was Dempsey before or not, but if we did, we didn't put two and two together until she made the call and realized she was talking to her brother Jack. Well, that's as close as I got to ever talking with him, even though I had seen him a few times up on East South Temple. I don't know that Jack was ever really, I think he was a Mormon or a Latter-day Saint in name only, even though he was a wonderful man, but I don't know that he ever really dedicated himself to the church in any way. But nevertheless, it was a unique experience for us young elders to have. As I say, I really wish that I had had the opportunity that I had had the nerve to ask her if I could talk to her brother, but I did not. So then we returned home, and I never heard anything about her or from her since, and I trust that she was rid of the problem from that experience. Well, now I'm not sure which direction to go. Russell, where am I supposed to go from here?
Well, let's talk about if there are any other experiences in your mission you'd like to share. By all means, share them. If not, then let's talk about your transition into the armed forces.
All right. I believe I told about President Rufus K. Hardy. He replaced President Henry H. Blood, and President Blood went home supposedly to recuperate, but he never did, and he died. And so when he died, then President Hardy was relieved of his duty in Los Angeles to go back home to take up his post in the Quorum of 70, when the President of 70. And then is when Elijah Allen came in to be our new mission president from Mesa, Arizona. And he fit his name. He was just a wonderful, strong, large Elijah type man. And he was a wonderful mission president. And I think I explained that we toured around the mission 2 or 3 times with our mission presidents and had that remarkable experience as young missionaries. I may have already said it, excuse me if I have, but after my mission, I went to work for the U.S. government for about 3 months out at the Tooele Army Depot, and then was drafted to, because I volunteered, I volunteered so that I could avoid the draft, as it were, into the Army Air Corps, and at that time reported into Fort Douglas up in East Benton, Salt Lake, got my papers, and then got the orders to go back to Miami. And it was to Miami Beach. And that was where we had our basic training, was Miami Beach. Now that sounds pretty rough, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And we were right in a wonderful, one of these high-rise hotels that had been converted from hotels to Army barracks. And they're right on the ocean, and it turns out we could run in morning, noon, and night on break and take a dip in the ocean and enjoy our life on the beach, as well as this very rough basic training which we had to go through. Well, it just so happened this was July, August, and September. And July and August were absolutely impossible almost in Florida. And without any air conditioning in those days, of course. But that's why that ocean was such a welcome thing to us, to be able to run in and take a dip and cool off. And our marching grounds was one of the beautiful golf courses right there just opposite the beach. I was not a golfer at the time, so I didn't quite appreciate what we were doing to that golf course. But we absolutely massacred the golf course. And those were our marching grounds, and we just marched all over the golf course in our basic training and learned all of our orders and how to march and how to keep straight lines. And then we went on bivouac and overnight journeys, of course,
What does bivouac
tenting out. And
What does bivouac?
bivouac means out in tents
Oh, okay.
with your little canteens and little ration box. And we would have to dig trenches for our latrines. And then we went on these simulated Army attack units. So we had our rifles with us, our Remington rifles, and they were very heavy. And all of our uniform, we had regular Army heavy khaki uniforms. During all this hiking, we'd go on 5, 10, 50-mile hikes, and we would simulate battleground training. And we would run along and fall on the ground and fire our weapons. They were all blanks, but nevertheless, we had to act like it was real. Well, this one time, they said, we need to train you, all of you people, to stay close to the ground. And the only way you can be sure of staying close to the ground when you're crawling along, and that you don't rise up too high, because that's very damaging. An enemy could pick you off if you rose up too high. And a lot of them wanted to get on their knees and go that way. But no, you had to squirm along on your tummy. So they said, too many of you are rising up too much. We're going to train you not to do this. And we want you to know that if you don't stay down, you're going to be hit by a bullet. We are now going to use live ammunition. We're going to aim at 3 feet above the ground, and you hadn't better be there in the path of those live bullets, and they took machine guns and just machine gunned over our heads while we were crawling along the ground. And we made sure we stayed low. But that was some of the training that we had to go through to get ourselves in shape for Army duty. And before we got through with that 3 months of training, we were in wonderful condition because we had to run and climb, and I'd never been in better condition than that in my life. So I felt like I was in very good shape to be able to go ahead and tackle the world and tackle the war the rest of the way. Well, down in that area, it was so hot that the little ailment or affliction called prickly heat was very common. And prickly heat was a red rash that would come on because of the terrible heat. Some people had the skin that didn't wasn't seem to be affected by it. But a lot of us who were light-skinned and Scandinavian type had this terribly miserable prickly heat all over our backs, our stomachs, our legs, and that's such a good name for it because that's exactly what it is. It's a prickly itch that you can never quite conquer. But they had a calamine lotion available to us, and we would smear ourselves with calamine lotion, and that would ease it. And then the dips in the ocean would ease it. But also out in the ocean, the waves would wash in some of these jellyfish. And I don't know if you've ever had any experience with jellyfish, but they can sting. And we were too innocent about it. First, we thought, aren't these fun? And we'd go up and try to have a little fun with them. And we were stung just like electricity with them. So we learned how to stay away from the jellyfish. They were just blobs of transparent jelly floating around in the ocean, but they were real live animals. So we had to learn how to stay away from them. So that was my basic training, kind of basic experience, but we had it pretty easy being in those hotels. And we actually slept on beds and had facilities there for showers and bathroom facilities, just like a hotel has, although they were stripped down of all of the amenities. But nevertheless, we had a good place to stay at night.
Grandpa, were there any church services that you could attend?
Church services we would attend on Sundays. We'd go right into the wards into Miami and Miami Beach. And yes, we would get to them on Sundays, and we were allowed to do that. From there, we got our orders to go on to what was called aviation student status. And aviation students now, having completed our basic training, we were all candidates to be aviation cadets and eventually pilots, navigators, bombardiers. And that's the goal of the aviation student and the aviation cadet.
Grandpa, really quickly, did you have any friends that were with you that had gone down to Miami Beach?
At this point, I had no particular friends from Salt Lake or any place, just the buddies as you meet in the service. But there was so much diversity of location and duty and KP duty and washing down the steps and keeping the yard clean and policing the area and all those things that go with Army experience, taking out the garbage and whatever, cleaning up the toilets and everything. But we didn't have a lot of continuity in our association. But later we did develop some very close associations. And it was interesting to me that my assignment and They went everywhere from there. I mean, they went to various states. But my assignment, and a group of us that I really did not know, were assigned up to Syracuse University in upstate New York. And there at Syracuse University, we went through a crash course of 3 months, which was the equivalent of a full year of university education, supposedly, they told us. And I can believe it because it was truly a crash course. And I learned, I had never been to university before, and it was a wonderful place to go. We stayed in the, again, we had nice places to live because we stayed in the fraternity homes and sorority homes that have been cleared out, and had all of our educational classes right there at the Syracuse University. I learned such things as geometry, astronomy, math, what's that other? There's another science that we studied quite a bit. Geography. But it was a crash course on all of these vital subjects. We didn't have such things as literature and art and those things. This was strictly the science. And I was intrigued and enamored. I think biology was another, by the sciences. And I was never really very adaptable to the sciences, except that I enjoyed them. And I especially enjoyed astronomy. And they taught us there a lot about starting to learn about navigation and how to find your way around if you were in the air. And it had to do with geography a great deal because we talked about the terrain and the geographical design of our country, of Europe, of Australia, of North America, Canada, Alaska, and Asia. We learned geography of all of these areas because it was never known where we would be going. But anyway, it was an overall education for about 3 months, which to me was a privilege. I enjoyed it, and I thought, this is great. And in between times, we would have all of our marches, and we were governed by them, by the way, by ourselves, by student officers. And so student officers were our commanders. There were, of course, regular Army personnel at the head of the whole thing. But we were literally governed by ourselves. And I happen to be one of the more mature ones, perhaps, because I have been on a mission, and I was a little older than some of them. And evidently they saw in me some kind of leadership capability, and I soon rose in the ranks. And first as a corporal, and then as a sergeant, and then as a lieutenant. I wound up being a general, and I was the head of the all of the. We had we had companies from A through K by alphabetical order. So A company, B company, down to K company, and there were perhaps maybe 100 aviation students in each company. So we had perhaps 700 or 800 aviation students there who were housed in all of these barracks or in the fraternity homes and attending the university, and yet going through our military training also. And so we had to learn to bark out commands of how to march, how to right face, how to left face, how to forward march, how to by the right flank, and all of those maneuvers. And there was one maneuver that was especially excellent, we thought, and that's the one where you pivot from one spot and the whole line moves right around the whole corner in straight line with the anchor man out here, all the rest of them moving clear around the corner and then marching forward. Well, we had to learn all those maneuvers, and eventually, as I grew in advancement, I was the man who was barking out all the orders for the entire for the entire group. And you know, I was not that kind of a guy, but somehow they got me involved in it, and I became a very military man at the time.
A through K, all the companies.
Yes, A through K. And we had a publication, and I have copies of it, and I have pictures with my stripes on my sleeve showing I had 3 stripes, and that was the highest you could go. I went from 1 stripe, 2 stripe to 3 stripes. And we were adjutant and then finally general.
Wow. And this was all during 3 months?
3 months, and that was October, November, and December. Because we had gone through July, August, September, and Miami now, October, November, December. And I might say that the local ward there, we just absolutely enjoyed thoroughly. They were so good to the service personnel, and they took us into their homes and into their churches and activities. And then also at the University of Syracuse, there was a chorus, and there was a chorus formed to perform the Messiah at Christmas time. It was made up not only of students, but community people who wanted to come in and sing, sort of community organization. There was a tenor there who took the part of the tenor solo, who went from there to the Metropolitan Opera. Donald, I can remember his first name. I should remember the whole name. Donald somebody. Marvelous tenor, and what a privilege to sing with him. And the conductor conducted the orchestra and the choir, who was the leader of the music head of the University of Syracuse in New York. And he was a great musician too. So we put on the Messiah there.
So you were able to sing in the
I was able to sing there and go to rehearsals and the performances. And the Army personnel allowed us to do this.
Were there many in the Army that went with you to sing?
I would say maybe 10 or 12 at the most. And half of them were LDS, who we went to church with. There we developed some very fine associations. I hope I can remember some of them. Lowell from Ogden, Lowell Smith, a wonderful man from Ogden. Bob Smith, who was an avowed atheist. And we had a lot of discussions. He was a fiery, red-headed young man, but a very genuine, true, loyal, patriotic young man. But he knew he was an atheist, and I knew he was not. And we had a lot of fun discussions, and we were good friends, along with others of the LDS. Jess, I wish I could remember all of their names, but there were some good LDS men there that we associated together, and Bob Smith kind of fell into our friendship ranks and got to know us, but he never would commit to admitting that there might be a God of the universe, a creator. But it is interesting, this is a little aside now, maybe 20 years ago. He lived up in Tillamook, Oregon, where the cheese factory is so famous. Maybe I told this before. Maybe okay. And I had this telephone call from Tillamook, Oregon one day, and as I say, it must have been at least 20 years ago, at my home on Gilmer Drive. And he told me, "This is Bob Smith." And we, of course, we renewed friendship on the telephone. We haven't seen each other for 20, 30 years, I guess. And I didn't learn that much about him. I never did learn whether he'd gotten married, had a family, or anything more about him, except that he said, "I'm coming to Salt Lake City in about 2 weeks, and I want to look you up, and we can have a reunion." I said, "Bob, that's great. Let's plan on that." Gave him all the instructions, and I never heard from him. I don't ever know what happened, why he never came or why I never heard from him. But to my dismay and to my discredit, I did not have his phone number and address to track him down. So I just had depended upon him, and somehow that had a foul up and it didn't happen. But I'm still curious to this day to know how he is doing. This Lowell Smith I mentioned passed away some 10 years ago. And, there were 2 or 3 others, if I could recall their names, that we were close associates and had fine church association together. It's been too long, and I would have to look it up in my journal, but I know I could find it if I had time to look it up. Suffice it to say, it was worth having them as friends. Now from there, we were aviation students. Am I going too long?
No, I just changing.
Okay, now aviation students, we now had graduated and now had become officially aviation cadets.
Did you have to take tests?
We had to take tests, and
if you didn't pass, what would happen?
Then you were washed out. That's what they call being washed out. There were quite a few who did not make it beyond Syracuse University because they did not pass the scholastic needs and the scholastic standards. And when they couldn't do that, then they were washed out of the program, and they were literally turned back into the infantry at that point. But I was one, and the majority did make it. And our next stop was going to be Santa Ana, California. So we got on troop to Santa Ana, California, Santa Ana Army Air Base. And that's where we received our aviation cadet training. And just briefly, what that was composed of was not only all of our rigorous physical PT, that continued all of the time to keep us in good condition, ready for conflict if need be at any time. But we stayed in excellent physical condition, and when we arrived at the Santa Ana Army Air Base, we were in barracks, literally in barracks there, but they were good and clean. It was a nice place to be, and I was back into my mission field, back into Santa Ana, of all places, near Anaheim, and back into where I used to ride my bicycles around as a missionary in Southern California. Only this was the Army Air Base, which was separate from the city and out in the Tules, so to speak. But at that time, we went through many, many tests and training for acumen, for capability on reactionary things, how we react in cases of crisis, how we react to sudden changes, sudden moves, sudden turns. We had psychological exams about once a month, where it would be psychoanalyzed about once a month, and what bothered us and what didn't bother us, and how we got along with our parents or their siblings, and and our personal conduct, personal habits had a lot to do with the psychoanalyzing and drinking and smoking and things like that. Drugs didn't seem to be an issue in those days. I don't remember drugs being an issue like it is today. But we would go in these, what they call trainers, aircraft trainers, simulators of flying. So we'd go in those simulated flying machines, like the cockpit of an aircraft. And we would have to watch carefully the instruments and see how quickly we'd react to tilting or up and down, or to dangers ahead, or just, it was really a remarkably scientific cockpit of training and analyzing on how you would do if you were a pilot or a navigator or a bombardier. It had to do with your, as I said, your reactions, your how quickly you would respond, and your acumen. And you'd have to, that had a lot of tests on putting square pegs in round holes and things like that. That you would have to do your puzzles just right, analytical things. That you had to put the peg in the right spot, and it's surprising how many didn't have that acumen. It didn't have the athletic ability or whatever you'd call it. There is another good term for it that I can't think of. Our ability to throw a ball or catch a ball, and coordination. The coordination was such an important part of this analyzing and being able to pass the tests. Well, eventually, after several months of all of that training and analyzing, we then were put through these final tests where it was to be determined whether or not you could qualify as a pilot, as a navigator, or as a bombardier, and where you had your highest acumen, and where you would most likely succeed in one of these three. And I remember you had to have at least a score of 7. Anything below 7, you were washed out. If you didn't qualify with at least a 7, if you had a 6 or below, on any, what I'm saying is, if you could get a 7 on any one of them, you could qualify. But if you didn't acquire a 7 on any of them at all, then you could not, and you were washed out of the program. And that's where we lost a good 50% of our young men that simply could not qualify with their coordination and acumen. And it took a lot of, I like to think it took intellectual response too. And with that score of 7, if you gained a score of 7 on any one of those, then you could continue on the program. And if you scored a 7 as a pilot, for example, or 8 or 9, the highest was 9. So if you scored a 7 or 8 or 9 as a pilot, you could go on to pilot training, or likewise navigator, or likewise bombardier. It just so happened I scored on all 3. I qualified for all 3, and I had my choice. I could become anyone I wanted because I qualified for all of them. And of course, the romantic thing and the prestigious thing would become a pilot. oh yes, we want to be a pilot. But I declined that, even though pilot was my highest. Bombardier was second, navigation was third in my qualification. And I was invited to be a pilot, but I told them if I have my choice, I would like to be a navigator. So that was my call.
And why did you?
And I went on to become a navigator because I learned more as a navigator and learned more in the way of astronomy and navigation. You just got a lot bigger, wider education than you did just how to fly an aircraft. How to fly an airplane was wonderful, and how to drop a bomb was wonderful. But navigation was absolutely an all-around education, I felt. And besides that, a pilot, they put their planes on automatic pilot and could fly for 2 or 3 hours just sitting there. A navigator kept busy all the time. Time went quickly, and the pilot got very bored sitting up there behind the cockpit on automatic pilot. And I knew that I would like to stay busy. I just didn't want to sit there and fly an airplane, even though that was fascinating and had so much intrigue. But interestingly enough, we all learned how, regardless. Eventually, our training all taught us how to fly the aircraft. We all got behind the wheel and were able to do it. And so we had our stint at learning, even though we didn't ever become literally a pilot. Now I need to go back to Syracuse University because that is where we learned how to fly an aircraft too. We had to get 10 hours of flight training in a little Piper Cub, just a little single engine Piper Cub. And with an instructor at our side, each one of us had to get 10 hours of flying. And so with an instructor at our side, we learned how to take off and fly the aircraft. We flew all around Lake Ontario and Lake Superior and all around the whole area.
So you learned how to
And it was
take off?
very, very cold. And we learned how to take off at the controls ourselves with an instructor aside. Of course, it took about 5 times before they gave us control first. And then we learned how to take off, how to land the aircraft. Landing is the biggest test of all. But while up in the air, we went at about as high as a Piper Cub could go. And I don't know how high that was. It might have been 6,000 feet, I don't know. Not very high. But we had to learn how to kick that rudder and put the plane into a nosedive and just nosedive down and down. And then to bring it out of the nosedive, you kick the other rudder and it would straighten out the plane and you'd fly right out like this, level. And we had to learn how to do that. And it would just spin and spin and spin. And so we got 10 hours of that kind of training. So we actually learned how to fly. And it's interesting to me. I don't know why they didn't ever send us up solo. But even on the final instruction or two, there was always an instructor there, even though we did the whole thing ourselves. But I wondered why they didn't send us up solo, but I guess they didn't want to lose too many aviation cadets. Too expensive.
Was it scary the first time?
Oh, it was very scary. Well, what you do, when the instructor showed us how, of course, the first time, said, what you do now, said, we're going to put the plane in a stall. So they put the plane in a stall, so it just sat there and shuddered. And it couldn't go forward because it was too steep an incline. So it just stand midair, just shudder and spin, then you kick the rudder, and down you'd go into a spiral, into a nosedive. So that was kind of fun. It was very scary the first time, but we got very accustomed to it, and we also get to do it ourselves and thoroughly enjoyed it. But now, we've come to the end of our aviation cadet training. I had qualified for all three and chose navigation. And from there we were sent to our various fields of training, where we would train in our specialty. And the navigator training was in Hondo, Texas, which was right near San Antonio, about 40 miles outside of San Antonio. And so we were down there getting our navigation training. There were certainly a lot of pilots down there too, so they must have sent some of the pilots down there too, because they had to fly us in their training all around Texas and neighboring states in our navigation training. So we had to fly them around and tell them where to go in our navigation. I always said I got to tell the pilot where to go all the time. So there were a lot of pilots. I presume that the pilots were sent down there too for their flight training as well as navigation, and the bombarders, because we have bombarders aboard too, and we did our simulated bombing runs over Austin, Texas, and Dallas and San Antonio, and up into Oklahoma, and fly all over, simulating these bombing runs. Wow. And navigation runs, and we had to go. Then we have several experiences of night flying as well, and the night flying was particularly stressful and taxing, because it really tested your capability to do all of this at night.
Because you couldn't see the landmarks?
You couldn't see the landmarks, right. I want to back up just a minute. In the Santa Ana Army Air Base, Hollywood came out with a moving picture about the Air Corps and the aviation cadets. And it was called Winged Victory. And it was a wonderful movie at the time, starring some very prominent movie stars, and particularly one was a youth who took the part of one of the aviation cadets. And again, I don't remember these names, but he was a very well-known young movie actor. And they wanted to come to the Santa Ana Army film on, what do you call it, on site, there's another name for it, on location. And so sure enough, this whole Hollywood contingent came in, and our squadron, of all things, was invited to be the ones to participate with them in the filming of this. And if you're not old enough to have heard of Winged Victory, but perhaps your parents have heard of it and have seen it. It was a sound film, which in those days was a good accomplishment. But Winged Victory had to do with all of the training of the aviation cadet. It showed these processes that I've explained and how they'd wash out because they couldn't do what was required of them. And the agony and the frustration that they went through of washing out, and the terrible disappointment.
And the hard work.
And the hard work, and yet the victory of achieving it and going on. It was a great show, and we were in that. And our squadron was in this big assembly hall, and I saw myself in the movie.
Did you participate in the flying as well?
No, we did not participate in flying
But you were
at
kind of
that
like
time.
an extra.
Yes, we were just the extras out in the audience, out in the, well, mainly it was this big auditorium where we were all gathered, going through our exams and our tests, and we were marching up and down the aisles a bit. Anyway, it was interesting that I did get in on the movie, and I was part of that.
Where did you see yourself so we can go back and find it? When
Oh,
we're watching?
I'll bet Winged Victory would be in the annals of the movie stores.
Oh, I'm sure.
You could research it and look it up.
Well, in what scene did you see yourself? Was it when you were taking tests?
Yes, it's when we were listening to some lectures, as I recall, and they'd pan up and down the aisles, and I happened to be right on the aisle, so I got in on the. It wasn't very prominent, I promise you that, and you'd have to search me out, but I did see myself. But I didn't see it until I saw it in the movie theater. In the movie theater, either sometime in Texas or somewhere along the line where we were stationed in the country. And I saw it again after the war. I made sure I saw it again. How are we doing on timing on that tape?
We've still got 30 minutes.
No kidding.
Yeah? Do you want to take a break?
No, I'm all right if you are. Well, if you've got 30 minutes left, I've probably got that much left in me I'd like to tell. And I'm obviously the viewers of these tapes will have to do it in breaks, in periods of time. You don't want to sit down for 16 hours and watch it all at the same time. Well, we received our assignments, and my orders took me to Hondo, Texas, right outside San Antonio. And there in Hondo, Texas, was Marshall Erickson, who was with me in Santa Ana Army Air Base too. We were both training as navigators, and he was one of my California missionaries. So we had both made it that far. But he was a different squadron than I, so we didn't have much reaction except at church. And at church, we would go there on Sundays and have an association there. And Marshall Erickson, who recently passed away some months ago, but was in our missionary study group all these years, Marshall and Wanda. And so he was down in Santa Ana as well as Hondo with me, but I didn't have, as I say, but very little contact except at church with him because he was separated in another section, another area, but we were both training as navigators. But I met two of my best friends in life down in Hondo, Texas, both of them from Utah, one from Salt Lake and one from Layton. The Salt Lake young man was Richard North, Dick North, and the one from Layton was Franklin Knowlton, Frank Knowlton. And I was the older of the three. I was the only one that had been on a mission, but we three stuck together. We went to church regularly on Sundays. We went into San Antonio on Sunday to church. And we had a lot of, any activities we did outside of our, we were all navigators, training navigators in the same squadron. But any social activities or any activities outside of our work base, we always looked each other up and did together. We went to a movie or whatever. And I have pictures of them hanging on my war wall in here. And we stayed together clear through Lincoln, Nebraska, through the California Air Base where we put our crews together over to Boise, Idaho, and then overseas and into India. And we all stayed together, all three of us, somehow managed to always have our orders that included the three of us all the time. Because orders were scattered and you could be split up very easily. But somehow those orders for the three of us always contained our own three names on the orders wherever we went, wherever we assigned in this country, as well as overseas. So we had a long, wonderful association. Both of them eventually became bishops. And Dick North was a bishop a couple of times and a stake president, and a very close friend of Elder, who is the president of the Quorum of the 12 right now.
Packer.
Elder Packer, a very close friend of his. But getting back to Hondo, Texas, where we did our navigation training, and as I briefly said that we flew around, we made very long trips that would take us into neighboring states, into Oklahoma, Tulsa, for example, and Kansas. And we would zero in on these cities or towns in these various states as though we were coming into a bombing raid. And the navigator would be up there and looking through his sights and pushing the buttons as though he were dropping bombs.
The bombardier, you say?
The bombardier in the nose of the plane, and I was navigating it and telling us how to get where we were going, either by looking at our maps and land sites, or strictly by using the compass if it was too cloudy and we couldn't see the ground. And then there I learned celestial navigation, which is up in the bubble of the plane where we had what we call a sextant, which we would look through and locate stars and planets, and by taking 3 shots of the location of a star or a planet, you take if the moon was up there, we could take the moon. We would take a planet and the moon and a star of name that was in and these logarithms, all these logarithms, we'd have pages of them, and they were already preset. And if you could get those 3 things to match in your logarithm, you could find out where you were and your position on Earth. It was really an educational system of navigating. So we would, if you had to have a triad, you had to pick, say, the North Star and a star in the Big Dipper, and then a star on the south, and get the 3 of them together and get them to cross lines in the 3 triangle. And that center line, that center cross, was where we were on Earth. So that's how we would locate our position. And I got pretty good at that celestial navigation. They always told us if we were within 20 miles of our target on celestial navigation, we were in good bounds. There's a good word for that, which I can't think of. Anyway, we were in good bounds, and we were in 20 miles. I usually could come within about 5 miles. And so that was kind of fun to be able to do that. By the time we got back to Austin, Texas, then over to Hondo with celestial navigation, because at times when we were training, we were not allowed to look at the ground. We had to depend on our celestial navigation as a matter of training. So I would take these shots of the stars, put them together, and direct the pilot on the courses you take to where we're going. And you had to have not only the direction, but you had to have the distance as to where you think you were, to how far it was to where you were going, how long it would take to get there, and establish an estimated time of arrival, what we call an ETA. So that ETA, I'd say we should be there by 8:57 or 16:22 or something like that. And we'd see how close I could come on my guesstimate and navigation skills. And if I were close to the target and if I had my timing right. And all of this had to do with the wind direction also. We always had to have a wind direction chart and had to have an instrument on board which told us the direction of the wind and the strength of the wind. The wind aloft, we called them. So if the winds aloft were blowing north-northeast at 50 miles an hour, we had to take all of that into our computation to arrive at the time and distance as to where we were going. It's kind of this is all very nostalgic reflection now, and so forgive me. And I always have this problem anyway, as you all know. But it's really quite a nostalgic recollection, and as I think about it now, it amazes me how the science of navigation could have been advanced that technically far and technically well at that time of our lives to be so useful during the war, and we were able to comprehend it and to administer it and to actually execute it.
In your calculations, did you use a calculator or was it by hand, your calculator? We had calculators. They were circular kind, and you had to use your logarithm readings and put them into the calculator circular thing. I can't explain it now. I've almost forgotten how to do it. But that calculator gave us our final reading on what we were to do. So yes, we had many helps along the way. If it were dependent upon right here, I couldn't have done it by myself. I had to have all the helps I could get. What if you were not able to see the stars nor the ground?
Then you simply had to fly by instrument. And by instrument was...
Repeat it, Grandpa, so that they know the question.
If we did not have visibility of the stars or the ground, then it was called instrument flying, entirely dependent on my gyro compass, upon the readings of the pilot on his instrument panel as to the speed we were going and the height, the altitude we were on. Altitude had a lot to do with it too. Flying at 10,000 feet or 20,000 feet made a difference of about speed. At the lower altitude is slower speed, higher altitude is higher speed. All of these things had to be calculated. Altitude, speed, wind direction, temperature even had to do with it. So we had all these, we had to read that, and fortunately the instrument on the pilot's instrument panel read the altitude we were on, read the airspeed we were going, and read the direction we were going, of course. And then, if we were in civilized areas, they had, at the airports, a radio beam that they could send out. And the pilots could tune into that radio beam, and they could follow that radio beam right into the heart of where we were going. But we weren't allowed to use that in our training.
Of course.
We had to do it on our own in our training. But worst comes to worst, they could zero in on that radio beam and find our way home. Well, that was exciting training, And as I say, it was hard to consider my experience thus far in the service as a great sacrifice, because I felt it was a remarkable opportunity for training and learning and experience and all of these things. So I just took it in stride as a great way to advance life, as it were. Well, after the graduation ceremonies was quite special because then we finally got our wings. And received what they called our commission as a commissioned officer. We were no longer aviation cadets, no longer enlisted men. We were now officers. And we all became lowly second lieutenants with a little silver stripe on our uniforms and on our hats. So we were now officers that any time an officer and enlisted men passed one another, the protocol and the command and the absolute law of the universe of the being in the service was when you passed an officer, you saluted. So even walking down the street, an enlisted man comes by, he would have to salute the officer. The officer would have to salute back. And so that was an entirely different change for me, because we were accustomed to walking down the street saluting the officers. Now we were the ones being saluted.
So you would wait for them to salute
Yes.
you?
Mm-hmm. And it was a strict code of pecking order that the enlisted man had to do that, or he'd get in trouble. Now, when we became kind of family-like on our cruise, that division kind of melted away, and we became just a good bunch of guys together. And yet, when we landed any place, the enlisted men went one direction, the officers went another. And the officers always had nicer quarters and nicer facilities.
So when you would fly, there would be enlisted men that would fly with you?
Yes. You know, to begin with, we had 5 gunners at various places at their gun spots, machine gunners. The tail gunner, the belly gunner, the nose gunner, and 2 waist gunners.
And they were enlisted men?
They were enlisted men. Along with the radio operator was an enlisted man. They could be corporals or sergeants, but not officers. And then the other man, key man in the crew, was called the flight officer, not officer, the flight engineer, the flight engineer. And he would always gauge the amount of fuel we had left, and he would always take readings on all of the facilities of the plane, the engineering features of the plane.
The equipment.
Equipment. And so he was the flight engineer. And as I say, there's a radio operator, and then the gunners, and then the pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, and navigator. And the pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, and navigator were the 4 officers. All others were enlisted men. Mm-hmm. Now, we picked up after we graduated and received our wings for our uniform, and the wings, whether they were a pilot wing or a navigator wing or a bombardier wing, they're all the same, beautiful wing. And we had wings for all of our uniforms, indicating that we were flyers, not ground personnel. We were flyers. And after our graduation there, it was interesting again, extremely so, that all three of us, Frank and Dick and I, were all retained for about 6 weeks right there on base to become instructors of additional aviation cadets as they were coming through. So we actually took our position that we used to be as students following instructors. Now we were the instructors instructing these new cadets coming through and explaining the navigation principles. And that was an experience too, where all three of us were assigned to different classes, and we were actually the professors, as it were, and the instructors of these classes of aviation cadets. We kept that up for about 6 weeks until such time as they gathered us together again to move us on. And we moved on from there to Lincoln, Nebraska. And then Lincoln, Nebraska, Lincoln Army Air Base in Nebraska in the windswept plains. We there did additional flight training, flew around, had additional training in our various pursuits of the 3 assignments, and all in all, just had some additional formal training and officer training as well. We there had to kind of go through what they called officer training school too, to learn how to become officers and, as it were, leaders, and to assume our place as officers among the enlisted men. And that was kind of an interesting tour of events too. It was there that Dick North met his fiancée and eventual wife. It's a very special experience. I was always insisting that Dick and Frank went to church with me. And sometimes I dragged their feet a bit. But there in Lincoln, this one Sunday, I told them they were coming to church with me, and they were, but I got them to go. And that first church meeting, and Dick North met a beautiful young girl there. Her name was Betty Tanland. And they struck it off immediately. I was kind of on the outside looking in. I didn't find myself a pretty girl there like he did, nor did Frank. Oh, excuse me. Frank was a married man. And no, I'm getting ahead of myself, pardon me. I'm a little ahead of myself, so get back to what I said. And Dick met Betty there, and he virtually immediately fell in love. And while we were there, he dated her all he could. And he wanted her to go to the USO places, and she said, no, if we're going any place, it's going to be to my church, to the church functions. And so she kept him on the straight and narrow. He wanted to do a few other worldly things and wanted to go out on the Sabbath to a movie or something. And she said, no. She said, I will adhere to my church standards, and if you want to come along with me and go my way, that'll be fine. So that's the way it turned out. Well, interestingly enough, while we were there at Lincoln Army Air Base, we had, it was over the Christmas, if I recall, it was over Thanksgiving or Christmas holiday. And we were actually given a leave, given an opportunity to go home to Salt Lake City if we wanted.
Wow.
Well, Frank was anxious to go back to his fiancée, who lived in Layton. And so all of us, we were able to get on a boxcar on a freight plane, and we piled in on a freight plane and went back to Salt Lake on leave.
Freight plane?
A freight plane.
Huh.
Just a cargo plane. We'd find a place, any place where we can find a space. And ride back to Salt Lake, we were able to get space on a cargo plane. They allowed us to do this. So we didn't have to spend our money taking a commercial flight.
Is this an Army cargo plane?
Yes, an Army Air Force cargo plane. So we were able to make that arrangement. While there, Frank asked me to be his best man. So I served as his best man in the Salt Lake Temple with his fiancée, whom we, of course, got to know very well. And so they were married there, and while on leave, I was able to be his best man, and he had, by that time, come well enough along in the church. We three had stuck together and kept our church attendance good and our standards high, so he was able to marry in the temple when he went back. And yet he was very virtually an inactive young man when we first met. So then when we returned, of course...
Did you get to see Grandma while you were here?
No, Grandma was not in the picture yet.
Oh, that's right.
No, I didn't know Shirley at this point. So then from Lincoln Army Air Base and those experiences of Frank getting married and Dick finding his fiancée, I was still kind of one of the out of the loop guys. But I met a young lady there that I dated, and we enjoyed each other. She was a great pianist, and we were very musical together, and she played for me to sing a lot. And so we sang in church. Even though she was not a church member, she would come and play for me in church. She was a Methodist, and we went to her church and sang too. And she was in Lincoln, Nebraska.
Neat.
Or she was in Wahoo, which is a little town outside of Lincoln. Wahoo, Nebraska. Ruth Way was her name. Anyway, we corresponded a lot, and we dated, and I think she fell in love with me. Even though I could not fall in love with her, I must stay with an LES girl. But anyway, from there we were assigned to go to Boise, Idaho. And it was in Boise, Idaho that we picked up our crew. We didn't have a formal crew at that point, but in Boise, Idaho, we picked up our crew that would be with us the rest of the time. So there we met as assigned to us, and the Army the Air Force officers organization did this on their own. They put us together as a crew, as it were. All three of us again went to Boise together. Each of us were assigned different crews. So we all had different pilots, navigators, or bombarders, and all of the other people on the crew. There were 11 total on each B-24 four-engine bomber crew.
We have 2 minutes left.
All right. And so from our Boise, Idaho experience, and that was another wonderful church experience because they had a wonderful ward there, and Bishop Peterson was our friend and did very well by us. And there I met a young man by the name of Thomas Kane. He was a young man still in high school who was aspiring to become a doctor, and he became a doctor, and Dr. Thomas Kane of the University of Utah Medical Center is now my doctor, along with being Shirley's doctor. I've known him all these years. And his sister and I, Helen Schloffman, did a lot of singing up in Boise. We participated on the stages in little operettas. I mean, music was part of our life wherever we went. And so we sang duets together. She had a great soprano voice.